Good afternoon. I think we'll get started a couple minutes late, but letting people trickle in. For our panel discussion on beneficial ownership, the way we have agreed to structure this, we want to make sure that we have this framed as a discussion with plenty of time at the end for your questions and your engagement in the discussion. So I think we'll just each briefly introduce ourselves. We have a longer bio in the conference agenda, but just so you have a sense of who we are. And then I'm going to give a very brief background of how we got to this point, the last year and a half or so in the international realm, beneficial ownership, and there's been a number of developments. And then we've agreed upon a set of questions, which I'll moderate only because we don't actually have a chair, but all three of us are very equally engaged on this issue, so I will ask the questions, but also be an active participant, so I'm not actually in the chair role. So just to kick things off, my name is Joseph Kraus, based in Washington, D.C. I work for a non-governmental organization called the One Campaign, which works globally to eradicate poverty, specifically in Africa. And I work on transparency and accountability issues, which is how I came to this issue.
Good afternoon. I'm Gonzalo Jalles. I'm the CEO of Cayman Finance.
Good afternoon. My name is Glenford Malone, and I work for the Financial Services Commission of the BVI, and effectively I'm a regulator with AML background and that type of good stuff.
Great. So just to get things started, to give a brief introduction on the issue and recent international developments. Quite a bit has happened in this space, especially in the last 12 or 13 months. So how did we get to this point? For a number of years, there have been a number of civil society organizations that have been, a number of whom I work with, who have been working on this issue in the U.S., in Europe, and beyond. In the U.S., there's been legislation sitting in Congress for the past 6 years, led by Senator Levin from Michigan. That legislation has never passed out of committee, so it essentially has languished and not gone anywhere. So there hasn't been a lot of traction on this issue. That all changed. If you had to sort of pick a date or put a date to when things really, a major development happened, it was April 4th of 2013. Which was the day that the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists based in Washington, D.C. began reporting on a years-long investigation into information they had received from the British Virgin Islands, the Cook Islands, and a number of other offshore financial centers. That was information that was leaked to them, 2.5 million files involving more than 120,000 companies. So this made a big splash beginning on April 4th of last year when a number of newspapers simultaneously began publishing stories based on the information that they had received. That investigation and that reporting continues. It involved dozens of countries, journalists from dozens of countries. I think they had more than 80 journalists involved in this. It really, in a way, was a game changer in terms of putting this issue on the radar screens of policymakers and governments. A number of governments responded immediately asking for this information. They wanted access to the files. Germany, Greece, the United States, France, Canada, a number of others. The Canadian government actually threatened to sue the organization when they refused to give the information to them. ICIJ's response was, your governments, if you want access to this information, change your laws so you get it. They're journalists and didn't think it was their obligation to reveal the information that they had. In May of last year, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which is a voluntary initiative aimed at increasing transparency in the oil, gas, and mining sectors, issued its new set of standards for countries that report on natural resource payments. And as part of that, it was encouraged that implementing countries include information about the beneficial ownership. A number of countries that are members of the EITI are now working on adopting that new standard, including the beneficial ownership component of it. The G8 last year, David Cameron, as the UK was the president of the G8 last year, David Cameron really wanted to make transparency one of the focal points of the G8 summit last year. The 3 T's, as they call it, tax, transparency, and trade. Beneficial ownership was part of that agenda. As an outcome of the G8 summit last year, and part of the G8 communique, all then 8 members of the G8 agreed to issue national action plans specifically on beneficial ownership, which did happen. And interestingly, all of the overseas territories and a number of the Crown dependencies also agreed to issue national action plans and did so. The UK government then moved forward with a public consultation on beneficial ownership, whether to have a central registry of information and then to make that information public, which they did over the summer and into the fall of last year, concluding with an announcement October 30th of last year at the Open Government Partnership by David Cameron announcing that the UK government would in fact issue or move towards a public registry of beneficial ownership information. Then the European Union, which is working to revise and update its anti-money laundering directive, of course, is also making this one of the central features. And it's an ongoing process. There's no final position yet, but it is interesting to note that in March of this year, the European Parliament approved a position that would require that information be publicly available for companies, trusts, and similar legal structures. That position by the European Parliament now needs to go through the rather complex bureaucratic process of being approved by the European Commission and by the Council of Ministers, which is an ongoing process, probably won't be settled until later this year at the very earliest. And then most recently, the overseas territories and Crown dependencies of the UK government, under great pressure from the UK, it should be noted, has been, a number of them have issued and been going through public consultations on whether to have central registries of beneficial ownership information, and a couple of them have included language about whether that information should then be made public. The British Virgin Islands, I believe, was the first to do that starting in November of last year. The Caymans followed. Jersey just finished theirs, I believe, last Friday. Montserrat and Turks and Caicos, their public consultations are currently ongoing. I believe they finish. One's on the 15th of May, one's at the end of this month. In the U.S., which is where I'm based, and I've been working on this issue for a couple of years, like I said, the U.S. legislation has not gone anywhere. The Obama administration, in part out of frustration over the lack of inaction and the stalemate in Congress on pretty much every single issue, and also because it's committed, both through the Open Government Partnership, but also because of the G8 Summit and its National Action Plan, is committed to taking meaningful action on this issue. In March of this year, as part of its annual budget announcement, it inserted language that effectively announces a different strategy for collecting this information through the IRS and tax information. It would still require legislation. They seem confident that that this is a greater chance of moving as a legislative vehicle than the previous legislation. So it remains to be seen whether or not that actually is going to move. And then finally, the G20 has picked up on this issue as well. Last year, the G20 communique, when Russia was the presidency, specifically called on countries, or the countries agreed to, in fact, implement the Financial Action Task Force's recommendations. And I know the Australian government, which is that chairs the presidency of the G20 this year and hosts the summit in November, has indicated that beneficial ownership is an issue that is strongly interested in and very much wants to make part of the G20 agenda, and the anti-corruption working group of the G20 has in fact been discussing this in its next meetings in June. So that's the most recent developments on this issue. There's been quite a bit that's happened. So to kick things off, we have a set of questions that we've agreed to, we think would facilitate an interesting discussion. So first, is the establishment of a central register of beneficial ownership of companies the most appropriate and effective way to ensure transparency? And if not, how might the legal regime be improved or strengthened to ensure access to information? Which one of you gentlemen would like to take the first shot?
I'm happy to kick off. There's a few things on the introduction that I think I have to comment on. First, the work of the NGOs has been very loud and clear. However, the issue of beneficial ownership is an issue that is not new. Is fairly old. and is one of the recommendations of the FATF. And it's quite interesting to see that, in fact, the UK and the US have struggled to comply with the previous recommendation of the FATF, not the revised one. And countries like Russia and others have simply failed miserably. So I think it's pretty interesting the way the media and other sectors have spun this around and put a weight on what this investigation came up and that was published April last year. Because the interesting thing is that would have not happened in places like Delaware and Nevada because not even the service providers have the information. So in fact it could only happen in places where the information is available. So I don't think it shows the efficiency of those countries. It shows a relative strength to other countries. And the real issue does not need a central registry, as I'll try to explain shortly. The real issue can be resolved in very different ways. So, going to the question, I don't believe that there is one answer for whether or not a central registry is the best way forward. And I'll try to make my point in the following way. Let's look at the UK first. In the UK, there are more corporate services providers in the wide London area alone than there are corporate services providers in all the overseas territories and Crown dependencies put together. So the size of the apparent problem is much bigger. Not only that, but those service providers in the UK are not regulated. Therefore, most of them don't have the information of beneficial ownership. So it's not an issue of where the information is, they don't have it. So, to me, when you look at this issue, if you're in the UK and the problem and the size of the problem they have, the proposed solution of a central registry where companies have to self-declare the beneficial owners of 25% or more, to me doesn't sound like a crazy idea. It sounds like more like a band-aid. It sounds like a quick solution for a very big problem. It's cheaper than the alternative that you have in places like Cayman, BVI, and others. Now, on the other side, let's look, for example, at Cayman. There are just over 100 providers in a 3 square mile radius. So all are heavily regulated. They all have the information, not only for those that hold more than 25% of the beneficial ownership, but those that hold at least, in every case, more than 10% of the beneficial ownership. So what you have, effectively you have just over 100 people that collect the information. Is not the company self-declaring, it's a third party that is putting his license, his livelihood, and possibly his freedom in the line to ensure that that information is collected and properly collected. While in the other system, you don't have a third party that is auditing that information. So, what does the central registry add in the case of Cayman? One argument is that it adds speed of access to the information. The reality is that the reviews of the FATF have not questioned the speed of release of that information. And if the issue is the ease of speed of the information, there are much better ways to resolve it than trying to create a central registry and much more efficient. What are the risks? In my view, the biggest risk is garbage in, garbage out. As I said, there's no third party independent with skin in the game ensuring that information is correct. You are effectively creating a system of less information. So the question is, if you have illicit intention, do you go to a place where you self-declare the beneficial ownership and you can have a company just with 3 other partners, all holding 24.5, including your wife and your kids, and a fourth party that holds nothing? or you go to a place where a third party that is independent, that is risking their business, has to collect information for 10 people. I think it creates unnecessary cost when you have a system that is working, and I think it has serious security risks, which are demonstrated by the case that was just discussed. But I'll probably get back to that in another question.
Thank you, Gonzalo. I think Gonzalo is quite right when he speaks about, what is happening in Cayman, and likewise the same is happening in the BVI. You have a regime which effectively requires beneficial ownership to be maintained. That is not a dispute you would have. It's clear it's required to be maintained. So the issue is, these new initiative that speaks about beneficial ownership being public register or register beneficial ownership. And it's clear, I think the BVI has clearly said through its consultation what it thinks should happen in terms of the options. There hasn't been any one in the BVI that says, yes, you have to have a public register, or yes, it shouldn't be public, or even indeed whether you should have a register. Because clearly we have always subscribed to the fact that our goal is to meet international standards, and there's no international standards on even having a register. There's international standards on identifying your customer, knowing who's the beneficial owner. And that is where we subscribe to the FATF requirements. And the requirements clearly says you have to know who owns, who controls, who operates a company. And that information has to be available in the jurisdiction and readily available to law enforcement agencies and other competent authorities. That is clear where we subscribe to from a regulatory perspective. In terms of the information on having a public register, that has its own drawback. Because you have a public register, as Gonzalo said, is the information really valuable? Who's going to maintain that? Who is actually going to pay for maintaining that? All of those have to be considered. And I think right now the consultation in the BVI is complete, and the information is being analyzed. But the document, it says, clearly sets out a number of issues. I think Gonzalo didn't touch on the issue of, well, he attempted to, but we'll leave it for a later date, of the issue of leaking information mentioned by Joseph, which is a matter of public record. You can't move away from that type of information, but let's rest assured this is not a problem that is an OFC problem. Think about it. Target lost information for 250 million users. That is 250 million. We're talking about, U.S. credit card issues and all of these things. Cybersecurity is a wider issue for the entire global financial system. So it's not an issue that is actually pertinent or unique to the offshore financial centers, but having that information out there, as Joseph said, led to a number of things and a number of decisions or consideration by the G12, the G8, well, G7 now, G20 and the like. And I'll also touch briefly on Joseph's comments in relation to, and Gonzalo as well, in relation to the U.S. not being able to meet some of these requirements. It's difficult to compare offshore jurisdictions with the U.S. and the U.K. and the like, because you don't have, you're not necessarily comparing apples and apples. You're comparing, in some regards, apples and oranges. But if you look at the international requirements, for example, the FATF requirements, and you look at reports out there, such as mutual evaluation reports, many of the offshore financial centers fared better than the larger onshore ones, simply because they have a significant amount of policies, procedures, and the like in place. So sometimes when you hear they say, it's a problem with the OFCs, if you look at the real reports that have been generated, sometimes the problem is more myth than substance. So a lot of what you'll hear me say, because I'm a regulator, I'm going to speak a lot about the international standards and how those standards are geared towards ensuring beneficial ownership information is accessible.
This would probably be a very uninteresting discussion if I agreed with my colleagues. We'd all just be saying the same things, so I'm going to disagree. I think that a central register of beneficial ownership information could be really important. I actually recognize some of the concerns that are expressed in terms of the uneven implementation, or enforcement, I should say, of various requirements across the world. Certainly, a number of the sort of stereotypical offshore financial centers actually have much better regulations in place than the large economies like the U.S. And a lot of European countries. And having worked on this issue in the U.S. and been very frustrated over the last couple of years by the inability to move this forward in the U.S., I certainly can sympathize with that frustration. But I don't think that addresses the underlying question, which is, just because there are different jurisdictions that are in different places on this issue, the principle still stands that we need to get to a better place where it's not so easy for those intent on engaging in criminal activity to be able to game the system, set up really complex structures, hide behind walls of secrecy, and carry on business as usual. I think that centralizing this information can be an important part of that solution. I'm not saying that that's the only answer. I would be open to if there are other ways or other mechanisms of achieving the end goal and getting us to the point where we all think we would like to think that we need to be. I'm open to that. But for the sake of this discussion, I think that I don't think we should dismiss centralizing this information. I think there's a number of very credible reasons for why that could be important and should be part of the conversation. I've spoken with a number of law enforcement agencies in the U.S. on this issue, and heard from them that having a centralized database that they can easily access that has information about the beneficial owners of companies is really important for them. It would make their lives a lot easier. It would make their investigations a lot more efficient, timely, effective, and less costly. And the second point, and related to that in terms of their investigatory work, they would avoid the risk of tipping off those that they're investigating. If they have to go to the company that holds the information that they want, 99.9% of the cases, it's going to be a company that's operating above board, not doing anything wrong. It's not going to be an issue. But in those cases, the ones that this effort is geared towards preventing, in that 0.1% of cases, whether there is nefarious activity being conducted, the person on the receiving end of that inquiry is now tipped off that they or their client is being investigated, and it allows them the possibility to move assets around, restructure, or just simply take off and leaving a vapor trail and effectively putting an end to the investigation. So I think that's a major point, I think, in favor of having information being centralized. And another point in terms of the cost effectiveness, I think it also would be more cost effective for governments, especially in a globalized world where increasingly the activity happens not just within one country, but entities are being set up in jurisdictions all around the globe for a single company. Having, for instance, mutual legal assistance agreements and requests, every time one of those comes in, the government authorities on the receiving end of that have to do some work and chase down this information before they can relay it back. If this information was already being collected, they simply could go to the database, look at the information, and send it along. So I think there's also a cost effectiveness argument to be made for this as well.
I'm going to have to respond to that, I think.
Please.
Again, the cost argument can't be done without having a starting point. And I think the problem is we have very different starting points. One argument that I think is very strong to central registry that I heard before, you kind of touch on it, but I think Dan brought the issue today about how TIAs have worked and about sometimes you need to know the answer to be able to even ask the question. I agree with that. And I think the issue of how we push back saying that these are fishing expeditions and so on is a very valid argument. And effectively what FATCA has said is, well, the US said, well, I have the US dollar and I'm going to fish anyway. That's what FATCA is. So if that's the issue, that's very easy to resolve. Remove the clause that implies it's fishing expedition. I have personally seen cases from Asian countries coming with requests that are fishing expeditions, and Cayman has responded. So that can be resolved very quickly. But I don't think that because of that, you need to end up with a system that is collecting less information of less quality. And I ask the question again. Let's assume you have a central registry in one country as it's been described by the UK. Let's assume you have a system like Cayman on the other. If you have illicit purpose, where do you go? To me, the answer is very quickly. 25% self-disclose instead of a third party, 10% minimum. So we are creating a system that collects less quality information. I don't think it makes sense.
Just on that point about the threshold, I think there's variances. Obviously, FATF is pushing a 25% threshold. The UK government's proposal is for a 25% threshold. The position approved by the European Parliament is for a 25% threshold, despite my organization and others pushing hard to make that lower. And I know that some of the overseas territories have lower thresholds, which I agree with, and 10%. But I don't think that necessarily answers or is a response to whether or not there should be centralized registers of information. I think that's a technical question about what the threshold should be. What would be the appropriate threshold to put up a greater deterrence or make it more difficult for criminals to use shell companies. I think that one of the responses to that could be that countries and those of us engaged on this issue could go back to the Financial Action Task Force and make a case for a lower threshold. So I think that's a technical solution that could be entertained. I don't know if it's necessarily a reason for not doing a centralized register of information.
Well, I think even the FATF recognizes 25%. I'm not sure they say 25% because my view is the FATF uses the requirement of a risk-based approach. So even if it's less than 1% and the person effectively at the back end controls the company, anyone should be able to get to that person. But the requirements effectively say in relation to beneficial ownership that the country needs to have that information before anything happens. That is what it now says. Even in the introducer type relationship where the requirement says at the very least you have to get the beneficial ownership information. So I think sometimes when we use the argument of law enforcement agencies saying access to information, some of the times the reason why law enforcement agencies and as well as other competent authorities such as tax authorities don't get the information is because they don't, within their own right, don't understand how to get the information. A lot of the times they ask the wrong person, etc. And just given from a BVI context, what the BVI decided to do many years ago is to develop what it calls its Handbook on International Cooperation, which is available publicly, which tells anyone in the world how to get information out of the BVI. And I think that is an issue that we face sometimes from an international perspective. Regulators come, regulators go in terms of individuals. So sometimes you have new individuals that don't have the knowledge of how to get that information and is requesting information, for lack of a better word, willy-nilly. And you're forced to refuse a request. And when you refuse that request, you as a jurisdiction now say to them, listen, we can't respond because X, Y, and Z. What we're trying to do is to say to them, we can't respond, but you need to look at this avenue and seek the information under that avenue. Because a lot of the time it's a misconception, but I think law enforcement agencies going to always want information quicker than they get it. Let's just understand that. Even if you have a public register and you're able, law enforcement agencies are able to go in that and to get that information, there's also the issue of whether or not for a court, how would a court decide whether that information is actually accurate and valid information. So there's a lot of issues with public registers that you'll have to consider, and internationally, everyone would have to drill down into determining what even a public register is and what will be the legal ramification for any information on a public register.
Well, that takes us, that's a good segue to our next question, which is who should have access to information about beneficial ownership? So assuming if there were a central register of beneficial ownership set up, who should have access to that information? Do you want to start?
Well, I could start. First of all, I think it goes without saying law enforcement agencies, competent authorities should have access to that information. That is a given. Now, the issue of whether the general public should have access or financial institutions should have access, again, I revert back to what the international standards are. The international standards requires law enforcement agencies and competent authorities to have access. If you want to have public register and you want that access to be for everyone in the world, then you have to ask yourself, will all, whatever it is, 200 and whatever countries in the world have the same requirement? And that is something every jurisdiction, whether offshore or onshore, would have to consider before it makes that determination. And I know we say that the UK, for example, has committed to public registers for cooperation, but clearly they haven't committed to it for other type of entities for various reasons. And even in the UK, they, as we heard earlier this morning, they have committed, but have they actually shown someone a piece of legislation to say, this is how we're going to do it, and this is the implication for it? Because I think everyone says a public register, but I don't think no one has actually put it in writing what this public register is going to look like, I mean, from the UK perspective. So I think my view is we should stick to the international standards as it is now until it develops into something different, and the standard says competent authorities and law enforcement agencies. And as offshore financial centers, we must ensure that on an international cooperation perspective, that we could provide information and a timely and accurate information when it's requested. It's on us to ensure that that happens. And once that happens on a timely and regular basis, you'll find other countries would sort of move away from the position of a public register, because the issue is really, is it available? You know, is it accurate? Does it help me to get a forfeiture, a confiscation, a conviction? You know, there's no sense of not getting the information or getting it 2-3 years down the line.
You're not going to be last in
No,
the question.
that's fair. Very fair. I don't want it to seem like I get the last word every time. That's very fair. So I think this information should be public, and for a number of reasons. One, I think it's good for businesses to know who they're doing business with, whether it be people that are entering into contracts with, whether it's knowing who the owners are behind the companies that they're getting services from. I think that that's an important consideration, and they would not otherwise have access to the information if it's only held privately, either in the central register or by company service providers or by the companies themselves. I think that it's important from a law enforcement perspective, and again, I've heard this from a number of law enforcement agencies that said having this information in the public realm would make their jobs easier, faster, less costly. Especially when they're trying to get information from other jurisdictions where they have to go through this bureaucratic process of applying for information, waiting for a response, et cetera, et cetera. That could take time. And again, they have to actually know who they're looking for. They can't just, as Gonzalo noted, just go on fishing expeditions. They can't just request information about everybody that's being held in that jurisdiction. So they have to have a sense of who they're actually looking for. And they may not even know where to begin. They may not even know where the company's actually registered, so they have to reach out to a number of different jurisdictions. This all takes time. In the UK recently noted that of the 280,000 suspicious transaction reports that they receive, they actually have time to investigate about 1,000 of those, which is 0.03%, I believe, or 0.003%. It's a tiny fraction of the total, in part because it just costs so much to spend the time chasing around different jurisdictions and different leads in different places and trying to track down who's behind companies. Another important consideration is that law enforcement is reactive, not proactive, and that's not a disparaging remark about law enforcement agencies who are under-resourced, understaffed, et cetera. It's just a reality. They follow the lead when they have a lead, but they're not going to proactively go through and look for information and look for something that looks suspicious. And I think this is really important when you're considering, and this is why my organization, which focuses on developing countries, comes to this issue, particularly in context where you're dealing with corrupt governments who may not want this information to be revealed. They're not going to participate or not going to respond to legal assistance requests. That there's no way for law enforcement authorities in the U.S. or elsewhere to get to the bottom of their investigation, or it doesn't allow the citizens living in those corrupt countries to actually hold their governments accountable. So we have there's a number of examples that I could point to. There's the use of 5 anonymous shell companies in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which purchased at a fraction of their true market value a number of mining assets that were state-owned. So clearly the government officials involved in that deal were getting kickbacks. It's impossible for law enforcement authorities to know exactly who was behind those companies, some of which were listed in the British Virgin Islands, because the information is not publicly available, and the government of the Congo is not likely to participate in any investigation, given that some of the highest government officials are probably behind these deals. That's just one of a number of examples that we've identified that really sort of that highlight the importance of having this information being put in the public realm. I think the ICIJ offshore leaks investigation really is telling in this area. In the last year, the number of leads that have come out of this, the number of stories that have been told about that identified suspicious transactions, a number of government officials, high-ranking government officials who have resigned as a result of the revelation that they secretly held assets that they had not previously disclosed in offshore financial centers, speaks to this point, that there are a lot of things out there that law enforcement simply would not have uncovered by themselves if they hadn't had the assistance of a whole army of journalists and watchdog organizations, and in some cases ordinary citizens, helping track down who the people were behind these crimes. And imagine if somebody in the FBI here in the U.S. is investigating, or has access to this information. There's a database full of information that they alone have access to. If there is the brother-in-law of the president of Nigeria's wife who owns 15 shell companies, they are probably not going to know who that person is and even think to flag that is a suspicious pattern of activity. But a journalist working in Nigeria is very likely to be able to recognize that person and their political affiliations. And this person may or may not be captured on a PEPs list. This is why ICIJ reached out to journalists actually working on the ground in a number of different countries around the world, because they're the only ones who really can go on and track this stuff down. So I think that's a critical reason why this information should be put in the public space. And I agree that there are some security issues. But again, I think that that's a technical question. I think there's ways to address those. I think thinking seriously about putting only the minimal amount of information that's necessary to effectively track down criminal activity should be put in the public realm, keep the rest private, only accessible to law enforcement authorities and tax authorities.
When I hear things like journalists are the only ones that can track this information, I really get scared. I don't think that is a journalist's job to do police job. And I think the answer we hear is if this information is public, police that can't reach it. And we never said that. We said that we need to come up with systems that ensure that law enforcement can access information quickly and effectively, definitely more effective than today, but that it cannot be an argument to make it public. I don't believe I should know how old Joseph is if he doesn't want to tell me, or if he didn't choose to put it in his Facebook page. I don't believe a wealthy person should be forced to tell his family how rich he is, or which companies his kids are going to inherit. I don't believe that those living in less safer place than where, interestingly, most of these NGOs are based and funded should be exposed to the risks of organized crime in their own countries. So we heard about exemptions already, which is some of the issues we've been hearing around. I don't think that exemptions is the way to deal with this. I think that whenever you create exemptions, exemptions are abused. So I think we need a better system. I think the information should be accessible to the proper authorities, including those foreign authorities that have valid reasons to require the information. I think we need to forget about the fishing expedition context. They need to have a way of asking broader questions. And I think the world is going to have to explore those cases where human rights are at risk of putting that information very broadly, so definitely not public. And I think in certain cases we're going to have to be very careful about even certain countries.
I think let me address one of Joseph's first point for a public register, and I'll address it from a regulatory perspective, because he mentioned that companies or people should know who they're doing business with. Now, that could never be an argument for a public register, because I presume if you go into business with someone, you know who that person is. So that already exists. You have to know who you're doing business with. So whether you're doing it with a corporation, whether you're doing it with an individual, you have to know who you're doing business with. There's no reason for a public register for me to go and search to see that Gonzalo actually owns a company. Because if I sit down and I talk to Gonzalo, I need to know who he is. If Gonzalo comes into my organization, I need to do my customer due diligence. I need to identify and verify who he is. So I think knowing who you're doing business with is already a concept ingrained in, I want to say before the beginning of time, because everybody would have known, well, you know, I'm doing business with my local farm, I'm doing business with my local poultry producer. You have to know who you're doing business with. Then addressing the issue of the UK and suspicious transaction report and how much they can investigate. Let's face the true facts. Even if you have a public register and a law enforcement agent or whoever it is goes into that register and finds information, he still is constrained by his own resources as to what he's investigating. And that is exactly why you have suspicious transaction reports. They're required to look at them from a risk base and determine which ones should be investigated. So I don't think a public register means that would be we'll have unlimited resources to investigate. So some of this information, you know, again, whether you're for or you're against a public register, there's advantages and there's disadvantages, and we don't live in a unlimited resource world. Maybe post 2007, 2008, we may have had unlimited resources then, but clearly it's not now. Whether for law enforcement agents, regulators, cooperation, or anyone, rest assured, including government agencies. And I would address from a regulatory perspective both what Joseph and Gonzalo are talking about, this concept that we heard discussed this morning. You know, you talk about privacy as opposed to secrecy. Now, there's no secrecy laws in none of the OTs or crown dependencies that I'm aware of. There's no secrecy laws. Information is available to who it should be available for legally, which is law enforcement and competent authorities. People are to some extent, under the UK or any law, people have their own privacy. So I think, you know, sometimes when you think about a law enforcement agent, what he would call secrecy may be privacy to an individual person who protects their own privacy. But internationally, there's a clear distinction about when someone or when a jurisdiction have information, what is considered never secrecy, which is access to that information, but privacy, where people are allowed the privacy that information is not sent away to anyone, anywhere in the world, and even if you give that information to a competent authority, that authority has to secure that information and use it for the right purposes. So I think let's be clear that there's really no secrecy there from a regulatory perspective, which if you're arguing that secrecy is one of the reasons to have a public register, I'm not certain that that is actually a valid argument.
Yeah, I just want to address quickly the point about businesses knowing who they're doing business with. Well, I agree with the point that businesses should know who they're doing business with. A number of the business groups that I've spoken with have said that's not always the case, and that may be the case for a large multinational corporation that has the resources to actually spend time having lawyers and others do due diligence on their behalf. But a number of small business groups that I've worked with in the U.S. say they don't have the ability to do that, so they feel like they're put in an unfair disadvantage. Just to point out that last year in the run-up to the G8, there was a petition that was circulated and signed by more than 20,000 businesses, mostly small and medium-sized businesses, saying that they thought this information being made publicly available would actually help them do their business, run their businesses more efficiently. So we've got about 20 minutes left. We have a couple more questions, but I think for the sake of letting you all be engaged in this discussion and not just listening to our views, I think let's take now a chance to see if there are any questions. I don't know if there's a microphone in the room, so you may have to yell. In the white shirt here.
Gonzalo had said something that suggested there may not be as much room for space between two all positions as I thought there was, and he said that he didn't agree that it should be an objection to it, for instance, if you request to say, oh, this is a fishing expedition. Is there any movement in any government, U.S. or otherwise, to say we should give some serious thought to allowing all of John Doe summons type fishing expedition request for information, so you don't, maybe it's a way to not have to send the registry on one hand, but still not have the catch-22 where you say, we're looking for this guy, we don't know who he is, but we want to find out until you tell us who you're looking for.
I mean, I have to say that's my personal view, first of all, is in no way, first I don't represent the government, so it's not the position of the government, and it's not even the position necessarily of the industry. I'm not aware of that view. I think we had a problem and somebody came with a solution based on their situation, instead of really understanding that maybe different solutions or maybe different solutions for different places. I think that conveniently the proposal and the question has been put, should be a central registry and should be public. And I think in reality there are three questions. Collection, central or not, public or not. Collection, I think the benefits are undisputable. I don't think anybody around this table or probably anywhere thinks that this information should not be collected. Funny enough, the ones that are proposing the solution are countries that don't even collect the information today. Again, central or not, I say depends. Public, I don't agree with. But I think the question has been conveniently twisted.
I think I'll answer the fishing expedition part, because under the BVI jurisdiction, they're not allowed. You have to make some connection with the jurisdiction. And even if you had a public register, just my views, and I think if someone was to search that and find that X, Y, and Z is connected, and you write to the competent authority, and the competent authority writes back to you and say, no, what are you going to write back and say? Well, check all the rest entities in your jurisdiction. That effectively, again, amounts to a fishing expedition, and no jurisdiction has the resources. I think even if you think about the larger jurisdiction, under the current international requirements, fishing expeditions are not something that are looked upon kindly, because you can't write to a jurisdiction and say, check 60, 70, 80,000 financial institutions and see if Glenford Malone has an account, which, well, I don't think he does, but, you know.
Sorry to interrupt you. FATCA has done that.
Yeah, I think FATCA has done that for backdoor way, because what FATCA has done is made existing U.S. laws worldwide. And I don't want to touch on FATCA because that's not my expertise, and I would hate to put my proverbial foot in my mouth, but effectively it does, because it says to foreign financial institutions if you have a U.S. Thing. So, but that is a whole different thing I dare not touch.
Sorry, I know there are two questions, but very quickly, the point I'm trying to make is FATCA has cut through that. FATCA makes you report on beneficial owner. And FATCA is followed by Europe and the US. So yes, we are going to a world of broader transparency. Cayman jumped and support both FATCA very quickly, and the G5 pilot, we were the first country outside Europe to support it. So we don't have a problem with proactive information. We don't have a problem with authorities accessing the information. I think that the fishing block is over. We are all seeing we need to move a step further ahead from just financial accounts. We don't think that the nuclear bomb being proposed is the solution. Two questions.
Yes.
There's a mic coming.
Oh, great.
Do you hear me? Yes. I'm a Turkish journalist, and I'm working on a story for a long time. And this question is for Mr. Malone. I went to BVI, and I met with the authorities from BVI, Financial Investigation Agency, and also from your department, from the Commission. And I'm working to find out the beneficial owner of some companies ended up in BVI. With the allegation of some corruption. You said that you are ready to cooperate with the law enforcement, but we cannot expect that any kind of cooperation with the law enforcement on this story. And that's why I met with the Commission authorities in your country, and then I submitted a letter on January 20 about these companies, about the two BVI companies, with arguing all the points why you should reveal the beneficial owner of these companies because of the serious corruption allegations. But since then, I didn't get any response. You didn't even deny my request, and you didn't say anything about my complaint letter. So what is the criteria for BVI government to disclose this kind of information if there are serious corruption allegations that you cannot expect any cooperation from the law enforcement?
Well, I have an easy response and a difficult response. But there's, again, the law requires you, as well as the international standards, that you be law enforcement or other competent authority. Journalist media doesn't fall under that criteria. I think I wouldn't go away from that. So I can't say why your request hasn't been responded to officially or not, so that is not one I would touch. But because you are media doesn't entitle you to the information. I think that's a discussion we're having up here as to whether information should be public or not, or who should access that information. Now, from a jurisdictional perspective, if the Turkish authorities were to use the international cooperation mechanism, that information is available to the competent authorities in Turkey. That is the international standards, but it's not available to people who don't meet that requirement. So, I can't sit here and say that I would go back to the office and tell them, send you the information, because under the law that is not available to media or to non-competent or law enforcement authorities.
I think this is a real-world example of that makes the point that I was trying to make, which is we need to think seriously about who gets access to the information and why. I understand law enforcement obviously needs to have access to it, but in cases, and this is a perfect example of that, where you have a government that is under serious corruption allegations, highly unlikely to make that request. And journalists, as the Fourth Republic, and I want to get into a philosophical discussion about what the role of journalism is, but I think investigative journalism plays a very important role in ensuring that governments and others in society are held accountable. So, obviously there's a much larger discussion to have around privacy versus secrecy. I think Dan DeReef's point this morning was great on that. But I think that having a blanket disqualification saying journalists never have any meaningful reason to request and have access to information, I think does a disservice to society and the greater good, and making sure the governments, wherever they are, whether it's the country that holds information or where the journalist is based, is held accountable.
Sorry.
Can I clarify something, Mr. Malone, if I may? Should I expect any response, from your department? By law, are you allowed to share anything with press if there are serious allegations?
I think what I would say is that any time you send a correspondent to a regulator, he is required to respond. I think I can't say that what you request is information that you're entitled to or lawfully entitled to get. So I'm not here saying that you can get the information unless you are law enforcement or other competent authority. I don't see your ability to get that information.
Sorry, we have a question there and another one here, but very briefly. Responding to Joe, everybody is innocent until proven guilty. And I think probably everybody around this room supports that. So I don't believe it's for journalists to come up and question that. And to your argument about this case where government is not prepared to investigate, perhaps if you were asking for PEP's registry of beneficial ownership, then we could have another discussion. But my problem is what they are asking is for a public registry of absolutely everybody. And that to me violates the right of privacy. Sorry, we have somebody picking up the questions, the hand from the beginning.
I have a comment, a brief comment, and a question. The brief comment is you all make the assumption that the purpose of the corporation is divorcing individuals from responsibility for their actions. Not limited liability, but secrecy. So I can hide behind a corporation and hide my identity. That was never the original purpose of corporate formation. The original purpose was limited liability to do business. And you had to have stated capital and public information about who the people behind the company were. That's my comment. My question is, what kind of regulated operation can the BVI have if there are hundreds of thousands of corporations owned by Chinese, probably involved in some kind of criminal activity, many of them, and what enforcement has BVI done to clean out corporations where there's a suspicion of criminal activity? So, for example, these Turkish corporations, if a journalist has raised these allegations, has the BVI government investigated to find out if they're harboring a criminal corporation?
I think that question is a far-ranging and very broad question, because you're effectively saying you made some allegations about certain individuals and jurisdiction that I wouldn't touch on, but I will use broadly in relation to the BVI as a jurisdiction is that, yes, where there is allegations of any misdeed by a BVI company, and that is communicated, and where we come to that belief, we do take actions against individuals and companies. For example, if you go to the Commission's website, you'll see a number of enforcement actions. We do bring up winding up orders in the courts against a number of entities. So yes, we do take actions, but I don't think I would sit here and say that a particular jurisdictions or category of people poses a particular issue, but companies throughout the world have issues, and just like any regulator, where we take action against those individuals, we make them public and we wound up those companies. So I don't think we're any different from any other regulator in the world.
You said that you have regulated service providers who have to do due diligence. So if there is some suspicion that these companies that they are service providers for are engaged in illegal activity, shouldn't those service providers have done due diligence? And if they haven't done it properly, where is your government in terms of cracking down on them?
But I think, again, I would refer you back to the Commission's website. I think clearly you'll see where we've taken a number of sanctions against many service providers. Some are very, very high sanctions. Some of them are effectively on the process of taking away the license. So I think I beg to differ if you're saying where the government is at, but where the regulator is at is clearly on the website. And all, just to be clear, all service providers, trust and company service providers, are licensed entities in the BVI. So I think when you say that we don't take action, just go to the website and you'll find some pretty large fines there, and you'll find some pretty frustrated people in the industry in relation to those large fines. So just like any other regulator throughout the world, when you look at your licensees and you look at them from a perspective of prudential supervision, on-site supervision, and they're not doing what they're supposed to do, it's in your role to take various action, and we have done so. And I think it's clear on the website, those enforcement statistics.
For those who are proponents of offshore public registry of companies, I think the law of unintended consequences holds that the introduction of such a registry in some locations, but not all, will lead to the migration of investigative material of great value from places that are subject to the rule of law. I live in the British Virgin Islands. My firm acts almost exclusively for victims of fraud to recover assets. If an unintended consequence of introducing a public registry in the BVI, which is home to 25% of the world's offshore companies, undoubtedly would be that very valuable investigative material will migrate to rule of law challenged jurisdictions or non-AML compliant jurisdictions like Delaware, etc. So if we hit more black holes from an investigative lawyer's perspective, the tougher our jobs might be. Secondly, I think that the idea of fishing expeditions should end, where an investigation by definition is a fishing expedition. I don't know why people are still offended by the notion of an investigation, because when you use an inflammatory term like, oh, no fishing allowed, what you're really saying is no investigations, please.
Whatever.
And then thirdly, I would just say that I think that kleptocracies and forms of government or public corruption on a grand scale, I'm talking now about grand corruption, is a form of a crime against humanity. And the example that our Turkish journalist colleague raised, and I know that our journalist colleague is with the New York Times effectively in Istanbul, a reputable outlet. If he has put together a letter like I imagine he did, linked to facts and documents, it creates a problem, because the letter is coming from a country with a challenge with respect to corruption, going to another jurisdiction and asking for help. Now, obviously, Mr. Malone's response is correct. Under the law, the FSC cannot share the information to the journalist. But an investigation could start, and has started in these cases in the past, I know in Jersey and in Guernsey, with effect to help developing nations to seek some justice against folks there who are not inclined to investigate themselves against their own crimes against humanity.
Yeah, I'll start with the first question, which I think is a good one. And I certainly, I think myself and colleagues that work on this issue all share that concern. But my response, a couple of responses to that would be, one, aren't black holes already being created? Jack's point about the ICIJ's revelation that some 37,000 companies listed in the British Virgin Islands and other offshore financial jurisdictions are linked to Chinese, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Now, obviously not all of those, maybe even most, are not probably legitimate companies doing legitimate business. But there are a number of high-level government officials who have been linked to some of those companies, and that raises, at a minimum, raises serious questions. Now, again, they may be doing absolutely nothing wrong. But if I were an ordinary Chinese citizen, would I want journalists or others to be asking those tough questions and making sure that those government officials gave a response? Absolutely. Another response, and this isn't going to be entirely satisfying, given that this is a long-term game. It's going to take probably decades. But we're working to make this global. You've got to start somewhere. And, you know, just in the last year, the progress that's been made, I think, you know, myself and probably most people in this room, if you'd asked people 2, 3, 4 years ago, would we be at a point where the UK government would be saying they're going to do a public registry? The European Parliament has approved that same position and includes trusts, which the UK government is very much fighting against, by the way. I think we would all thought that we were crazy. So I think that we're getting there. It's going to take a lot of time. This needs to be a truly global international effort. If there are jurisdictions that create a race to the bottom, then that is obviously going to, this is going to be an ongoing discussion. We'll be back here in 5 or 10 or 15 years having the exact same discussion. So this is why I think it's important that we don't, you know, those of us, I mean, I think we all agree on the end goal, stopping money laundering, stopping criminal activity. But if we spend too much time arguing about the technical details of how we do X, Y, or Z, then we're not using energy that could be used to constructively and proactively engage in a collaborative effort to finding a solution that actually truly achieves the stated objectives. And I think that, you know, again, Jack's point about the BVI not perhaps doing due diligence on all the companies that are registered in this jurisdiction, I think it's a valid point. It may sound harsh, but I think there's some truth to that. But it's not up to the BVI. I mean, BVI is, in terms of their resources to pursue this, is limited as well. So I think this is another argument for why we need to broaden the discussion about who has access to information, and then at minimum it should be journalists, because they have responsibility as journalists to do some of this work and highlight when things look suspicious and ask the tough questions. It's their role.
I think, let me just respond to Joseph. The BVI meets its international obligations. It's committed to meeting the FATF requirements. And those requirements are met through the service provider. That is internationally recognized, and that is a standard that is allowable. So to say that the BVI or the government of the BVI should go behind every single company, that's an option that is allowable under the international standards, but it's not the option the BVI has chosen. The option the BVI has chosen is through the service provider. And that is, let's be absolutely clear, for many of the offshore jurisdictions, that is the international standard that is acceptable. So we're not moving or we're not operating outside the international realm. Once the international standard is set and moves to a different level, we're not saying that we object to that level. What we're saying is we haven't seen that standard move there yet. So I think while Joseph speaks to some extent as it's a done deal or as if it's internationally done, yes, I understand what he's saying and his goal, but let's be clear, as we speak right now, internationally we meet the requirements and we will continue and strive to meet those requirements.
Gonzalo, we're almost out of time. Gonzalo, I'll give you the last word if you want it.
I think I agree we all want to stop criminal activity. I don't necessarily agree that the discussion is just technically how we do it. I think the discussion is the unintended consequences and probably the role of journalism, which is probably for another whole panel.
Great, thank you so much.